be following these 4 different maxims, but it's still creating a good interaction. Usually someone's laughing, there's a turn-based scenario going on, and that still adheres to what it means to be cooperative. And the second point here is that conversation is naturally a multimodal experience. By that, I mean, we don't just use one sense. We are using our voice, we are using our eyes, our ears, our hands. And when you think about this, it kind of throws a wrench into some of the conversational interfaces. Sometimes voice is not the best fit. Sometimes you need to have voice plus something else in order for the experience to actually accomplish a user goal or create like a lasting impact. So the way that I would recommend in general thinking about these interfaces and the way that they are being used today is, 1, start with what humans are actually doing now, like what is typical human behavior, and then 2, adapting that behavior to what is technically possible in these devices. And I think that's the general framework that a lot of people are using to think about the new use cases. But of course, as technology improves, there may be other use cases that we have not thought about yet. So voice is everywhere. By this, I mean, it's on all our devices. Conversational interfaces are on our phones, they're coming out in cars, customer support lines, appliances, all things like that. And IVRs, interactive voice response systems, actually began in the 1970s. Think back to maybe like a typical customer support line or a call center. This has been around for decades at this point. This also has to do with the speech recognition technology that has been available since the beginning. Excuse me. Sorry, recovering from a sore throat. So in 2011, Siri was started or introduced in our iPhones. 2014, Alexa was around. 2016 is when Google started introducing their Google Assistant. 2017, Samsung came along, and 2018, we started seeing a lot more home integration through like home hubs and other voice appliances in the general home environment. We've always had chatbots, not always, but I think it's been one that's been around for quite a while. And then kind of when I start to mention conversational AI, the term that I'm using here is any sort of appliance that is used to understand, process, and respond to human interactions. So we're thinking machine learning, deep learning. As a designer, that's not my expertise, but I do understand generally how it all fits into larger framework. There are ways for us to communicate today in the digital age, but a lot of the principles of conversation have remained more or less the same. So definitely think about how we talk today, what is natural, and what the limitations are right now for conversational interfaces, and where those gaps are is what designers are trying to solve for. All right, so there are a few levels of interaction maxims. I'd say the first one is something we briefly discussed earlier, the cooperative maxim. So what do I trust you, or in this case, the system? This is when we start thinking about how do we want to design identity, interest, value, and trust in a system through personality, perhaps. Second, we have the fact that it is a goal-oriented system. Why am I here? Why is the user here? Why is the machine trying to solve a problem? This is where you start to create orientation, such as establishing boundaries towards an action of a goal. So providing options, where am I in the experience, reminding someone of where they began and what other navigation controls they have. And then you have two more. Turn-based is kind of the foundation of an interaction. One person goes, the other person responds, and then it goes back and forth, back and forth. So this is starting to think about when someone is actually talking to a machine, what are the prompts? When I say prompts in conversation design, this is anytime you're asking the user for information. So usually in like a question or like, tell me about this. It's more like an open-ended situation. And then finally, error handling. How does the system provide guidance and bring the conversation back? So in fact, humans actually repair our conversations. And I mean repair, I mean anytime we are talking about a set topic and then we sort of go off course, wherever we make like an aside, we actually repair and come back to our main theme about every 2 minutes as humans. So think about how much that would throw off a machine. These are all things that we have to consider when we think about good interactions and the questions we need to be asking to enhance the customer experience. And all of these 4 things should go into documentation. As a writer and designer, I think documentation is absolutely crucial to understanding if your goals are aligned to what you are actually creating. So I'll go over a little bit more what that looks like, especially when you're collaborating with other team members who are not necessarily designers. All right, so this is a graphic from an excellent book that recently came out called Conversations with Things. And I would highly recommend this book to anyone who is thinking about getting into conversation design or just getting a very high level understanding with actionable tips about what goes into creating these devices and experiences. When you see this, it definitely reflects a lot of how humans process information too, when you hear something. So the first step is ASR, which stands for automated speech recognition. A lot of the reasons why we don't have great experiences with voice devices is the accuracy or lack of accuracy of the ASR. These are things that aren't being captured correctly. These could be accents, dialects, slang, things like that all go into this first step. And then also, depending on the modality, if something has a screen or you're in a place that it would maybe they're using touch or some other sense, visual data is also captured to kind of understand where the person is in a given context. Next, we have NLU, which is natural language understanding. I'm sure some of you all have heard of this. It deals with kind of this machine reading comprehension of the experience. It falls under the NLP umbrella. Is natural language processing. If you were to write it out in an equation, NLP equals NLU plus NLG. NLG is natural language generation. And when you see here utterance, utterance means a unit of speech with a clear pause in between. So any sort of unit of speech, like a word or a sound, can be considered an utterance. Fourth, we have intent matching, which is making sure that what the user is requesting actually aligns with something that the machine can do. So for example, if someone asks, what is today's date? The intent match would be like find a calendar date or something along those lines in the back end. And finally, text to speech is the speech synthesis portion of this experience. So creating a spoken version of the text. And overall, Machines can do this pretty fast nowadays. The ones that do it fastest and most accurately, though, will be the ones that you see kind of stand the test of time. Obviously, some are lagging behind more than others, so that's something to keep in mind as we go through this. All right, so when we think about conversational interfaces, we think about how conversational do they actually have to be? Because there's a lot of different use cases. A lot of times you don't even need something to be that conversational. And so there's definitely a couple strategies or ways to think about what type of bot or assistant you want to create. And kind of goes into what sort of personality you'd also like it to have. So for the first example, any sort of transactional system like fast food ordering, anything that's task oriented, only like a one-time interaction, keep it simple when it comes to the personality. Really just like try to stick to those interaction goals that we discussed earlier. No need to maybe create this whole persona around it. However, one level up, say you have something like Bank of America's Erica, the personal assistant for managing your financial solutions, the transactions. Definitely want to remember who the person is, kind of what their previous interactions were. Notice that it has a name, Erica, and it has a personality behind it if you ever interacted with it. Other qualities of this is having good memory, being efficient. And then finally, we have kind of what we think of as the AI assistants. We have Alexa, Siri, anything that has like a more long-term use case, something that people are using on a daily basis, definitely in addition to everything I've mentioned for the other two, usually have a backstory, usually respond to small talk. So a little more conversational, not so much what we call command and control, which is more anytime you just use something to complete a single task. So now I'm going to switch gears, not so much talking about what are these interfaces, but how do we actually make a good customer experience for these interfaces. So I think high level, for any of you who have a UX background, I think one of the most important things to consider is the level of trust between user and system. I think from the very beginning, you always need to try to sympathize with users, listen to them and cooperate with them and make sure that you're actually designing for what they want, not just what maybe the business is trying to push or other stakeholders are trying to create. At the very least, any sort of conversational experience should be efficient, it should be transparent, and it should be consistent across devices. I was looking over Google's conversation design guidelines, great resource. If you ever check out their page for designing for Google Assistant, and they point out a few aspects of what makes conversation so good as an interface. One is that it's intuitive. We all talk, or we all have a method of communicating, and it is very much natural to us. So whenever technology can replicate that, it's good for our mental models and ease of use. Typically, conversation is faster, or it can be in certain use cases, than going through a screen and actually clicking through all these things. If you can just get from point A to point B by asking, by all means do that. Also, when it comes to multitasking, for example, if you're driving, you just want to, instead of actually going over and looking at something, using voice is a great example of when you should be kind of designing for the context. And then finally, conversation allows users to speak freely. This is something that you definitely want to keep in mind for certain use cases. So anytime spoken or conversation is used, imagine that other things can hear. So maybe in a public setting, we don't want voice being used to activate like an ATM, but maybe that would be a time to use like a written user interface. So things like that, where voice is great for the most part, but you need to consider who else is listening. And I'll kind of touch on that. I think a big concern for a lot of people is data privacy, and what devices are listening and how the data is being used has always been a challenge for the industry. So this is one of my favorite quotes about interaction design, especially as it relates to conversational interfaces. So I'll let you all read that for a moment. But definitely recommend this resource again, Conversational Design. Erica Hall is one of the big experts in the field. But I think this quote really hits home not just what we see about good product design, but just general good interaction guidelines as well. So this is a high-level look at what a conversation design process looks like. Obviously, all teams are different. Most teams don't believe in having this, one approach fits all process. It's definitely not so much a linear process. It's more of a go back and forth, make sure everyone's collaborating iteratively type of process. So in something like this, looking at steps 1 through 6, you can definitely imagine how various stakeholders could contribute, but I'm gonna focus specifically on what conversation designers do in each of these processes. The teams they work with are almost always interdisciplinary. So I'll go into that in the next slide as well. So the first step, discovery, is really where you're trying to figure out what's the opportunity, what are the challenges. This is where the stakeholders can start to kind of research a direction they want to take. What's the market doing? What are the problems that need to be decided or worth solving? And how long is it actually going to take? For next step, planning. This is a little bit out of the scope of a conversation designer. I think it's more of like a product manager's role. However, definitely want to get everyone together at this point, including developers, to understand what features are needed, what the roadmap looks like, and then finally going on to concepting. This is a lot of where the conversation design work occurs, kind of creating this design hypothesis and drafting the personality, the flows, the intents, the prompts that go into the conversational experience. Next, we have prototyping. Prototyping in general, we want to keep as low fidelity as possible because of the cost that it could accrue if you make something that's really high fidelity and you don't want it anymore. So definitely recommend something that I usually do is just like pen and paper, spreadsheets. VoiceFlow is a wonderful tool. For those of you who've tried it, I think you will likely agree. I think it's a very good prototyping tool for voice experiences. Kind of emulates the flowchart process that I'll show later. Fifth, we have the developers who are really taking lead at this point, making the actual product using the code. Obviously, developers should be involved earlier on, and this is really their time to shine for steps 5 and 6. And then 6 kind of goes into optimizing post-launch improvements. Where else can we build intents and flows and other features? So this is what I would consider kind of the general conversational AI team. This is different for every company, different based on the size, the maturity. On the top half is more of the developer side of things, or the more technical side. Bottom half, a little bit more design oriented. I'll briefly go over what the typical responsibilities are. And after this presentation, we'd love to hear if others are fall into these job roles, like if they experience something similar on their teams. So kind of the data scientist is the one who's training and optimizing the machine learning models using algorithms, NLP, DevOps engineer, focusing on the cloud infrastructure, maintaining development infrastructure and processes. Backend is the one who's integrating with the systems and databases, perhaps building out APIs too. Product manager is really the one who's serving as a bridge between development, business, and design. They seem to know a lot, at least in my experience, about how everything is coming together, especially when it comes to the roadmap that I mentioned before. Copywriter and designer. This is some companies have different dedicated roles for both. I sit as kind of a hybrid between these two. Copywriter would ideally focus more on content, personality, and voice, whereas the designer takes all those things into consideration, but also is more focused on the actual user experience, blending user and business needs to create the flows and kind of point A to point B, how are these goals being achieved for user and all involved. So when we think about what is the use case, I included this value irritation model for you all who are kind of considering how this could apply to a customer experience. So the example I'm using here is using this graph to plot what customers say. Say they're, in this example, kind of thinking about customer support lines, people calling in, or maybe messaging customer support, what is actually being asked of customers to the businesses. And more importantly, why they call in the first place. So what is the actual intent or the goal behind why they reached out? So if we go through each quadrant, kind of start to see like where you could classify all of these intents of why customers are calling. If something falls into the eliminate category, maybe this could be times where there's too many prompts for the customer. Like say the average time is much longer for a particular experience because the way that the IVR or whatever interface is designed, there's just too many questions. Anything like that, we want to try to cut back on. Say we have encourage on the top right. So this is anytime maybe you're handing off from an automated system to a human. Anything like that could add a lot of value for the company and the customer, but not necessarily would want to automate something like that if it's just like a one-off or not a super common instance. But focusing now on the two green quadrants, so the first being simplify, and for those of you who can't read the text, so the y-axis is the value to the company, and the x-axis is value to the customer. So when we think of simplify, anything that is a process that could be reduced, that you could reduce time and complexity, but it's a very common ask for a customer, definitely try to do that. Alternatively, you could automate something. So this is anything that the system could be trained to remember, such as previous interactions, any sort of stored data from the last time that the customer was there, and anything where you can kind of pick up where they leave off. So to create a more seamless and frictionless customer experience. All right, so we have here the 4 general steps that I would use to bring a conversation to life. I think a lot of questions I get from people who are not in the field are just like, how does this even happen? Like, what does it mean to bring a conversation from just from concept to reality? There's a lot of people involved for something like that to happen, but designers still kind of go through this kind of 4-step process, very similar to a typical UX process, but maybe just a little more tailored to the medium of conversation. So the first thing, requirements, back to just early discovery and research. how are we communicating? How are we leveraging current human behavior to mirror that into a system? Happy path, what makes up a conversation? Happy path is the shortest amount of time or turns that it's taking for someone to go from someone to just start an experience through an invocation. Invocation is anytime you say a word to alert the systems, like Alexa is the invocation word, or for something like that. So the time it takes or the turns it takes, that's a happy path. However, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of repair paths involved. And the time you kind of diverge or the conversation doesn't go as planned, you also have to consider that. And that's where the iteration starts to come in. You know, how does the system actually adapt to the different utterances that people are saying? This is both a design responsibility, but also a bit of the data scientists and developers having to go and kind of train the machines on what people are really saying, and really validating that through more user testing. How does it perform in the wild? I'll go through a little bit of what the different types of testing methodologies could be for something like this, and maybe it may ring a bell for those of you who are already in user research. All right, so I think there's always been historically like the designer and developer divide, I think, when it comes to a lot of product design. So these are some tips that I'd recommend when it comes to collaboration for design and developer teams, and really anyone in between, just the entirety of who is creating the product or user experience. So one thing to keep in mind is when you're creating something for a user, especially coming from a design perspective, yes, you are creating something for them, but you're also in the process creating something for the developer, because after you design something, you need someone to actually use code to bring something to life. So you need to think about a lot of their needs too, particularly how are the developers communicating, through what channels, how often. I think these are things to consider for any team, but specifically for developers, you want to involve them as early as possible, because even though they may not be writing code until later on, the more that they understand about the end-to-end experience, the better the product will be. Second, again, prioritize experience, and this means experience over features. Especially when you think about a minimum viable product, less is more. If you can show that it's actually getting from point A to point B with few features and really having an enhanced experience without all the bells and whistles, then you are achieving your interaction goals. And it's better this way to kind of catch things earlier rather than later if you're really focusing on streamlining the experience itself. And also when you think about prioritizing the experience, you need to start thinking about documentation again. So what do the different states look like, different interaction states? What does, if this is multimodal, how do the animations sync up when you think of audio and visual at the same time? Does the copy make sense? Is the voice assistant reading text to speech, or is it saying something a little different out loud versus something maybe shorter on the screen? So things like that are all part of the larger experience and not just adding different features. Things change fast. Designs, documentation will change, timelines always change, funding, personality styles. If you switch out team members, this is sort of a given in a lot of these design processes, but with good documentation and kind of established communication styles from the get-go, hopefully this is not super disruptive to our team and workflow. And then one of my favorites of kind of my tips for working together is that passion is a motivator. It is something that is contagious. As I mentioned, developers might not be involved at the earlier stages of this process, but if you do involve them, then they have a stake in what's being done, and they will be inherently motivated to adhere to what you all are saying, to understand the strategy that's being used. People won't just come in and think, oh, they left me out earlier, I'll just do what my own section. If you're involving people earlier on and letting them have a say, they will want to continue kind of contributing. And I think this is something very important to think about, not just for involving developers, but like other stakeholders just earlier on, or as early as possible. So a little bit more on kind of where design fits into this collaboration process. This is a 3-step look at kind of what I would encounter from thinking about user experience and then actually putting it on paper, on a device. These are the steps that I typically take, and they're all very collaborative, but we start from the concept. So this part requires a lot of generative user research. Think user interviews, surveys, any sort of customer data like customer ratings, comments, social media. And the point of all this is to answer, what are the opportunities that exist? What behaviors can we actually leverage? And how big of a problem is this in reality? It also is important to think about discoverability. This is something that I'm sure you all have encountered. If you have an AI or like a voice assistant, you're not really sure what it can do some of the time. Well, like think of any sort of Alexa skill, or if you try to ask Siri something, I mean, you might not know what its limitations are. So this is something that we also have to think about, like how do people find out about what we're creating? And I think this is something that's hard for voice industry in general, because we can't see like a list of things on a screen unless we paired modalities. Something we could think about when creating a new concept in general. So when we get to the script, actually for script and sketch, I personally kind of go back and forth between these. I like to sketch out behaviors. So for the first, starting at point A, what does a person need to do to get from point A to point B? Not even necessarily like what they're saying, but just the behaviors and the context around it, because then this will inform what you actually would need to write down in the script. What goes into the script is, it can be a variety of things. If something already has a fully fleshed out personality, make sure you're aligning with word choice, the voice itself, the behavior. If something's brand new, then maybe at this point you're going to start thinking about how embodied do we want this conversational interface to be. I'm kind of going back to that slide with the 3 tiers, what makes most sense. And then from there, going into what are the prompts that we need to create. Prompts again, or anything, anytime you're kind of asking a question to get some user input. And the best way that I've found to document all of this is really just a spreadsheet, kind of writing down like what are the different questions that need to be asked, the possible answers that could be said by a person. And this relates back to user intent. So what sorts of slots, entities, sorry, I'm dropping a lot of conversations vocabulary here, but slots or entities are kind of like categories of information that are needed. So say you're creating like a pizza ordering experience. So a slot could be like a topping. So things like that. What do you need to get all this sort of information? And finally, once you have all that, it could be very rough. It could be in a spreadsheet. It could be in a Word document. Kind of wireframing how it all fits together in flow diagrams. So similar to what you see on the screen, kind of like a tree diagram, decision trees, yes or no, what happens then? And then it could start getting very large when you start thinking about happy path versus repair path. So I mentioned earlier that conversation is inherently multimodal, and we're starting to see this much more now. This is something I found on Google's design guidelines. It's it's very well documented here, kind of showing what modalities need what sort of information. So for example, for a speaker and headphones, you would only need the spoken prompt, whereas on the other end, if you have the screen that you're constantly interfacing with, you'd want to think about, okay, sure, someone could be listening to a prompt, but also they're seeing something because they're using these other modalities. And something to keep in mind also, like something like a watch, it's on you, like what other modalities could you use? Could you use like a vibration, like a blinking light? Things like that could all be things to think about when you're in that scripting phase or even the concepting phase. And obviously, as iteration goes along, you'll start to see where there's improvement, where you need improvement, either like cutting down the voice part or maybe rearranging kind of priorities for what people are really using it for. And this is also where user testing becomes most important. So there are a couple ways to approach usability testing for a conversational interface. One is called Wizard of Oz testing, or WOZ testing. Very strange word, but you essentially are trying to pretend to be the system. This is very helpful for AI because creating intelligent interfaces takes a lot of resources and time. So any opportunity you have to just pretend, either like role playing, reading a script, is very valuable. For Wizard of Oz testing specifically, this is a good way to test pathways before getting the training data that you need for the NLU. And really, you can also do this with clickable interfaces too, where you just have any sort of item that's pretending to be a more intelligent or complex system than it really is. So even like a piece of paper pretending to be a machine, like clicking through it and just watching how someone would use it, even though it's not truly in front of you. And then the next set of testing would be considered more iterative testing, and this could also be broken down to asynchronous and synchronous testing. So asynchronous would be anytime you are sending participants instructions on how to kind of almost like a task list of what they need to accomplish. You're not actively watching them do it, but they are able to write down comments and feedback on how they experience the product or device. The con on asynchronous is that you can't really ask questions as they come up. You only see what they give you after they go through everything themselves. However, there's synchronous as the other option, which is longer, more intensive. You're moderating the session. You're scheduling people to come in, and you're watching them live. It's nice because this allows for like a think aloud questioning, so you hear what the person is doing live. But again, it's very costly, and you may not have enough time or resources to do this. For something like utterance generation, which is just trying to get as much data on how people are talking, I think asynchronous is probably the best way to go. Just if you're able to have people write down like what they said, even though you're maybe not seeing it live, that could be a very valuable insight. And again, the goal of all this, testing could be done later on, absolutely, but something like Wizard of Oz testing, the earlier you can do this, the better. The whole point of a low fidelity prototype is to get to the point where something is good enough to start coding. You don't need to have everything fully fleshed out, as long as you have an understanding of, are the expectations of the user met? Is it covering a good amount of the intents? Are you capturing most of the utterances? Are you actually designing, or do you have the modalities that you would need to fulfill this experience? All right, so these are 3 questions that I would recommend asking yourself and your team throughout the process, kind of to make sure that you're all aligned in your collaborative goals. I'm also coming at this from a writer's perspective. So a lot of this is also things that I would keep in mind when I'm like writing like an article or just writing dialogue. Like how do we communicate? Am I using words that are too slangy, or maybe other people, if they're coming from a different region, wouldn't understand? Or is it too informal of a tone? Things like that. But also for a larger team, how are people actually communicating, especially now that we're all remote? Are people getting the FaceTime they need? Some people like Slack versus do some people like face-to-face or virtual face-to-face meetings? Like trying to understand what people prefer, I think from as early as possible helps so much when it comes to the times where you really have to sprint and get things done. Why are we designing this at all? Something that I really enjoy something that came from one of the books that I mentioned here, I believe is Erica Halt's book. Like, what are we here to do? Like, what is the point of what we're designing? Sure, it might sound great as an idea, but is it actually feasible? Do we understand what the limitations are? Kind of like grounding yourself in reality is always important when you start moving from the design to development phase. And then finally, what is essential? As a writer, I think one of the things we always have to think about is, are we communicating the ideas we want in a way that's simple and effective, and not using all these extra words or extra information that's diluting the communication between the user and you, or the user and the system in this case. So really trying to focus on, again, not so much features, but the experience itself. Like, what do you need to get from point A to point B without having to put more resources into things that don't really actually improve the experience that much, like very marginal improvements. So right here, I'll pause and have you all take a look at this. Really interesting research about kind of the future of voice technology and how many people actually use a smartphone that has voice assistants versus own a smart speaker. And I'm sure many of you fall into these categories. One thing I do want to call out, I think it's interesting that the first few industries are definitely the ones that are leading the most. I think it's going to continue to do so, mostly because of the technology investments that have gone into these industries to automate, but also because of the current situation with the pandemic. And I'm actually kind of covered this in this next slide. I think the voice industry has experienced quite interesting growth in the last year and a half. And maybe I'm a little biased because I'm part of the industry, but I think it would have gotten to this point anyway, but maybe the pandemic accelerated it in a way that we didn't foresee because of the needs to adapt to new behavior. And I think one thing to call out is the privacy statistic. So a lot of people are concerned that about passive listening. That's something that we are, as designers, we need to think about at what cost do we need to get this sort of data to improve the experience versus how much do people actually want to give that access to larger companies. We also have to think about safety. This is one that I thought was really interesting. So 86% of people surveyed in this Speechmatics survey conducted last year thought that voice technology could improve their experience at a business or an event because of the sanitation aspect. So you're not actually having to touch a screen or a button, maybe. So even thinking about, you're in an elevator, could you use your voice to just say where to go instead of using the touch screen? Things like that are very are things that could definitely become more prevalent in the near future. And then finally, web conferencing transcription had the most positive impact. No surprise there. We've all been glued to our screens using Zoom and other conferencing devices, but transcription is another feature of voice technology, when you think text-to-speech, any sort of speech synthesis is another place where voice technology really shines. I'd like to go over to, I know that I keep mentioning these personal devices that we all have, but there's also other innovations that are happening constantly outside of maybe what we typically think of, as these devices. And I do mention a couple of them in here, but things are changing very fast. All the news that I'm about to share has happened in the last 2 weeks. And every time I check back on one of the big sites, which is voicebot.ai, there's always something new. Really interesting to keep an eye out on the new things that are happening there. So one big one that you may have heard about, Wobot, is an automated conversational agent. So it's a chatbot, just got $90 million in the funding round, helping to monitor people's moods, help people learn about themselves through sort of like a therapeutic framework. Really tries to follow cognitive behavioral therapy, conversational design or framework there. So I think that's a really fascinating use case in the healthcare sector. And I'm sure that there's a lot more to come in the healthcare space, not only with chatbots, but with voice as well. Another one that I thought was pretty fascinating is Joya AI, and this is something that got unveiled for the Toyota Sienna. It's going to rely on Google Cloud and Dialogflow to process questions from drivers and allow them to gauge what Sienna's features are just by talking in the car, which is pretty incredible. And then I'm sure like something like this, and a lot of the ones that have cars are likely multimodal since you have the screen, but really anywhere that you're able to use your voice, there is a really excellent use case. We have something from Twitter, more on the accessibility side. Something that they recently enabled is a feature for live captions for voice tweets. So if you have Twitter, clicking on the CC button for closed captioning will enable these live captions, which is a fantastic accessibility feature that they just released. And a really interesting one that seems a little overdue, just because of the amount of use that Alexa gets, is that you can actually change it from a female voice to a more masculine voice. All you have to say is users can just say, Alexa, change your voice, and it goes to this other like male sounding voice. You can also now add celebrity voices for about $5 each. So you can have a little fun with Alexa that way. So there's, as I mentioned earlier on, there's a lot of limitations when it comes to voice technology right now. One big one is data privacy, a lot of the ethical implications as to what companies are doing with our data, and how they're using it to improve or maybe learn too much about us. One thing to keep in mind is a lot of, or I know at least Apple is starting to do this, where they're going to start having on-device processing for Siri, which means that what you tell Siri will not directly go to Apple. It will be processed on the device itself. So that's going to improve speed. It's also going to improve or increase privacy that way. Next, we have the speech recognition accuracy problem. I think this is really just a technological limitation of how much data is being used to train these machines. The machines are only as good as the data that they're being trained on, and that's the case for a lot of AI. It's also difficult because I think a lot of the frustrations people have are that we're teaching them how to use something that's so natural to us. Trying to teach people how to talk is never, you don't want to make people feel stupid. I think that's a design principle for user experience design. Never try to do something like that, but it's hard when things are not so accurate and you kind of have to make suggestions as to how to talk to something. And then finally, this goes into the last one of contextual understanding. There's a lot of limitations when it comes to how much a voice assistant remembers previous interactions. Just like imagine if you had a friend who just always forgot like what happened last time you hung out. I mean, it would be so frustrating. So that's something that a lot of assistants are trying to grapple with. Something other small things too could be, especially with appliances, thinking about if you're in a room and you're asking for like lights to go on, maybe it should know, typically every time at this time of day, like you're typically turning these lights on versus if you ask later in the day, you turn these lights on. So things like that. I think other companies are trying to design around routines for how people are using these. I think that'll be very valuable going forward. So here we have a chart of what people typically do with smart speaker voice assistants. I'll let you kind of take a look at that. As you see, a lot of these are very much command and control, like one-off tasks. And really, I think where voice shines is when you're able to do something very fast without interrupting your current action. A lot of these fall into that category. So say you're cooking, turn on the radio or turn on like Spotify, what's the news? You don't have to move anything. You can just continue what you're doing. You're in your flow state, but you're able to also multitask. I think, again, there's this issue of discoverability. Maybe a lot of people are so used to doing these things and they don't necessarily branch out and explore what other applications or skills are available. So that's really a challenge for the voice industry. How do we market these devices or these capabilities to people without sort of teaching them how to use the device? So I think that's something we'll definitely see more of in the coming years. Which brings me to my last slide, so these are all predictions that I am foreseeing for this general industry. I think one big one that we've already seen is the integration of these devices into our everyday objects. It's really augmenting how we already live our lives. I think car is a fantastic example. Any sort of smart home is another really good one. I don't believe that we'll see AI replace workers to the extent that some people think, and at least in the near future. I think a lot of what these devices are going to do are try to help and augment our lifestyles in ways that other technology has too, or other like smartphones or things such as that nature. Next, I think there's going to be more personalization. I would hope to see things that go from just command and control to actually conversational and being a little more proactive, not just waiting to see what we have to say, but knowing that we have a need and having a smart assistants that understand that capability, and also being able to keep up with dialect and slang, I think could be really fascinating. Kind of having devices that grow with our own public discourse can be really interesting. And finally, something that's more intelligent, something that's always learning from us, but also teaching us a little bit about what it's capable of. I think that would also solve the problem of discoverability. How we design those interactions is to be determined, but keeping this all in mind, I think we are at a very good, in a good path with the increasing technology and the rise of use of voice technology, that hopefully these kinds of problems will be solved in the not so distant future. Thank you so much for being here. I'd love to continue this conversation. There is below my contact information, and I now open the floor to questions. And Swapna, would you like me to change my screen to you?
No, it's fine for now. We can do that later. But yeah, I'd like to open it up for questions, as Julia said, to the audience. Anybody, feel free to unmute and ask away. Or if you all prefer, you can put in the chat box.
Use your voice because we're talking about conversational.
Yes.
So let's use our voice. I can start just to kind of break the ice a little bit. So Julia, one of the points you brought about is utterance. Utterance where you have words and that map to what the user might ask. What have you seen to kind of make up for the different ways? So there are two questions. The first, like, what have you seen to make up for the different ways that a person can ask for the same thing, as versus what you have, maybe what the conversational system is being trained for?
Yeah, I think I understand the question. So I think from my own experience, prompt writing is very, very important because it is a way to guide the user to give the information that the system is looking for. As an example is the difference between asking like which topping do you want on a pizza and then not giving any answers versus tell me about the toppings, or tell me about the toppings you want. We have cheese, tomatoes, things like that. So being able to guide the user at any point, if you know what the system is looking for, and I think that's why it's really important for designers to understand what the intent matching system looks like, because if you know that there's only a very limited amount of toppings or a very limited amount of things that people can select from, you should say that and guide the user to those options rather than leaving something open-ended. There's also the scenario of you either ask someone like a list reading, so you just keep asking like a yes or no question, and then versus people maybe want to just give an exact answer right away. So I don't know if that completely answers your question. I think these are just challenges that occur pretty often when there's this mismatch of what people are really saying versus what the system is capturing. And the way that a designer needs to think about it is, what is the intent matching from a technical perspective? And then how can we create an opportunity for the user to give that information the most accurate way and the most simple way as possible?
Okay.
What are you seeing in the way of language? English by far the most common, but what comes up next, and how do we handle the multiple dialects in every single language?
That's a really good question. I focus, so Samsung has a variety of users around the globe. I am only focusing on the English side of things, but I know that there's a lot of growing uses in general, not just at Samsung, but across the voice industry. Europe is actually, I think, outpacing North America now with a smart speaker adoption, same with Asia. So I personally don't work very much with localization, and that's what you're describing, the act of being able to design conversations for different languages. I would like to get more involved in that. I think it's a really fascinating sub field of conversation design. One thing that I want to know, when you see these kind of translated experiences, I think what tends to happen if it's a poor experience is that things are literally translated. And the best sorts of cross-lingual experiences are never truly translated, they are interpreted. So really thinking about like transposing the true cultural significance of one scenario to another. And then also thinking about how are people in one culture used to taking turns, like maybe people want to have more turns. This is stuff that you would have to find out through user research, which is again not what I am always looking at when it comes to localization data. But there's a lot of cultural nuances that come with presenting a situation and giving the right options, because maybe for one culture, you're used to maybe hearing a bunch of lists read in a certain way. Maybe in another one, you just want to get something done a little faster in another way. Good question. I'd like to learn more about it myself. I think if you want to take a look at actual statistics, I would recommend going to voicebot.ai. They have a ton on like recent adoption statistics and what it looks like around the globe for various devices.
Thanks.
Any other questions, audience? I do have one, Julia, if nobody else is wanting to ask right now. But as far as the intent, you spoke about the user's intent. What are some of the issues that you have seen typically with intent being misinterpreted, and how do these algorithms try and rectify it over the course of the learning process?
Yeah, I think every company is doing it differently. I imagine that a lot of the larger companies have like dedicated NLP teams, going through what what data is available for user utterances and what functionally is capable of, or how the system actually functions and what's capable of what intents can be matched. I know a lot of when we think of products or experiences on our phone, a lot of times, say we're trying to do something on a maybe navigating somewhere, it'll punch out to an API, right? Like maybe will get something for Google Maps or Yelp or something, and those tend to not necessarily be under the control of the like once you get into those apps, you might not have the same amount of control as you would have like proprietary experience. So I think it's hard to match everything. The only way to really be sure that you're capturing as much as possible is by listening and kind of processing what is actually coming out of these conversations. I don't sit on the developer side when it comes to like the machine learning, what actually goes into it. I know that what you need as much data as possible, and not just data, you need labeled data. So you need a mix of AI going through and ensuring that this is the right data for the right use case, but also having humans go in and make sure that the context makes sense. For certain words, there's always the case of someone saying, like I think a common one is like login. It's like login could be a noun, it could also be a verb. And if you're not properly training on both those scenarios, then things will happen where the system detects it as one or the other, and then the rest of the experience is just not what the user intended. So I think really being careful about parts of speech too is something I've noticed as a really common problem across everything. And I also noticed that someone asked a question, Audrey asked something in the chat about any thoughts on enterprise use cases. So I personally don't work on something like, I think the most common enterprise use case would be something in like a call center or something along those lines. I did used to work at a call center when I was back when I was in healthcare. There were a lot of opportunities to use automation and kind of understanding customer intents by reviewing kind of call logs and things like that. And maybe, so in my experience, the nurses were the ones really talking to the patients through these call centers. But if we were able to have any sort of automation where it could triage someone before getting to the nurse, could have saved a lot of time for any routine tasks. I know, I think Nuance Communications is one of the big companies that focuses on enterprise use cases. So maybe take a look there on what they're doing nowadays. But yeah, I personally can't speak too much about it. I know that it's happening across the board for those industries that I put up earlier. So like banking, healthcare, and education, but I don't have a ton of experience working with those specifically.
Yeah.
May I ask a question?
Oh, certainly. Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
I actually work in enterprise, and we have an IVR, and maybe you can speak to this. You touched on it a little bit earlier. I'm curious what you have to say about building trust in the system, right? We've done a lot of work to like really advance our IVR. We find that customers still don't trust that it will work, and they like to just say, you know, drop to an agent, give me an agent right away. Do you have anything to say about how to think about, you know, helping customers build trust in a successful system, a conversational system like that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I guess there's a couple of ways to think about it. I would say the first thing to think about is why, or can you detect why they don't trust the system? Is it, say you have these surveys at the end of calls, like maybe they're rating something that was maybe too slow, the options weren't given in the initial like automation, uh, something about what, I'd say maybe time and just like the lack of navigation is probably across the board, probably one of the most common reasons people don't trust voice assistants. Again, if you have one bad, it's similar with graphical user interfaces on screens. If you have a bad experience on a website, are you really going to go back? So it's really just being able to identify what about the experience was not excellent, and can you remedy the situation? I'm trying to think for more like practical advice for this would be, so I think one thing that I've noticed that users are frustrated about is when they say something and it's not supported, and all they hear back is, "Oh, I can't do that." That does not help the user at all. It just tells them that something can't be done. So even just having better error handling could build trust in the system or rebuild trust. So instead of saying, "Oh, I can't do that," maybe say, "Oh, I'm sorry, that isn't supported yet, but I can also do this." Or perhaps some of the trust issues came with mishearing someone with like some sort of maybe they have an accent or something like that. And those are a little tougher because it's a technological limitation. You can't really design around something like that as much. But I think you could still give the options to properly reprompt the user, to give them a way out, essentially have an exit strategy if people are not enjoying the experience, and then also know when to hand off to an agent. I think that's also very important because at a certain point, after asking 3 times, someone's just going to get frustrated and want to talk to a human to solve something, especially if it's taking too much time. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I think a lot of what we're seeing is historical experience. Like our former IVR didn't work very well. A lot of IVRs don't work very well, and I think customers are just expecting this one will not work. Yeah. And we have done the thing where we prompt them, you know, you can say this or you can say that if they've said something that doesn't make sense or they want to drop to an agent right away. But yeah, that's a very helpful answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Precedence has a huge part to that.
Mm-hmm.
We do have one other comment here in the chat, and then we can start wrapping up. But Christine is asking, I'm working on integrating AI into the LMS, so the learning management system, to build personalized learning experiences. Did you have a question, Christine, based on that, or was it just a comment?
I didn't get the rest of the question typed in. At what point, I guess if we assume voice at the beginning and we manage to get the initial, because trust is always a big one, right? When you first come in, that's always big. And so if we can get past that, is there a point where voice is no longer the thing? right? Where you should go to a different mechanism because it's going to be more efficient.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually a really good point that you bring up. I think as someone in the industry, you do have to take a step back and think about, okay, voice is awesome. And I think that because I'm part of this space, but you're completely correct. It's not always the solution to the problem. And that's when you have to think about, from that chart that I was showing you, on what is the process. You should probably start thinking about, is conversation the right fit at that very first stage? Because yes, even if it is the right fit, so I think in the example of kind of the IVR system, yes, an automated voice is good to an extent, but at what point and what scenarios do you need to hand off to a human? And then similarly for anything that has like a screen, I'm trying to think of a good example. Maybe if you are, maybe I'm trying to think, there's definitely scenarios where you would want to, it's very contextual. So thinking when you are maybe on the go and you want to use voice, but then I think actually a good example could be when you're searching for, you're just searching for an answer to a very generic question, like, oh, like what year was the Olympics last held in Greece or something. So you're trying to search that. Maybe you immediately get your right answer. Maybe the voice system is able to find that. Maybe it's a more complex question and you start hearing a list of items and none of them serve your purpose. At that point, is it really worth your time to just listen to all these different options? Or do you want to, for the sake of efficiency, move into a screen and get the option to maybe hand off to your phone? So something like that, where there's a good seamless experience, maybe you have like an Alexa speaker integrated to your phone. You're asking Alexa these very complex questions. It's giving you options through voice, but you really don't want to sit and listen to everything. If you're able to design something that they'll say at a certain point, hey, I noticed you're going through all these questions. Do you want me to show you what I've searched onto your phone? And then using your phone to continue that could be a really good use case.
So one of the things I know I wanted to mention, as we're talking about experiences, this does come back to the traditional human computer interface, or just human, how humans process things. And one of the things that just keeps coming to my mind as we're having this conversation is the concept of cognitive load, right? So as we were having conversations with a speaker, or having conversations that teachers having conversations with the student, even in a physical setting, right, outside of the learning management system, we just have to balance the cognitive load and be aware of how much cognitive load the end user is willing to take in that situation, depending on the goal that he or she has in mind. Because if we ask complex things over voice, but the cognitive load that it generates is not conducive to voice reasoning or voice thinking, you might just go straight down to a paper, pen and pencil, and say, that's how I want to solve it, because you can't respond to all questions over voice, or all inquiries over voice. So that's kind of one thing that just keeps hitting me as we are talking about like voice interfaces, is being aware of the cognitive load we're asking the end user to take on.
That's an excellent point. Cognitive load is a very important thing to consider, not just for voice, but visual cognitive load too. If you're seeing too much information on a screen, how do we simplify that and get users where they want to go?
Well, that's great. I mean, there's definitely different facets to it, and from human computer interaction, cognitive load becomes like the basis of it as well. And I think in all kinds of interfaces, even they're looking at brain interface, and how like the embedded chips, and how you can have that reading being manifested into some kind of action. So there's definitely a lot of research currently being done, and I think it's just it's just going to get more robust as more research and practice is going to be implemented with utilizing the learnings. So that's
Awesome.
great. Let's
Awesome.
I'm just gonna just switch on to sharing last slide for the event for today, which is gonna talk about our next month's event. So I will just share my screen right now. Just a sec. All right. All right, are you guys seeing my screen as yet?
No.
No? Okay.
Christopher just asked a question, Munir Swapna, will the recording of this event be available afterwards? Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah, we can definitely share this, on our via link, because this is going to be uploaded. So we can definitely share that if everybody's okay with that. So yes, I'm just going to announce this. So basically, for our next month's event, we are going to be talking about. So the next month's event is on August 26th. And it is going to be, the topic is focused on the customer and employee as a person. And our guest speaker is going to be Alex Genov, who's the head of customer research at Zappos. So we're really looking forward to hosting Alex, for next month. And it is up on our meetup page, so feel free to sign up. But it's really going to highlight, with AI, it's definitely automated. There's a lot of market research and several different modalities of doing research, but how do you really take that human-centered approach and, think of customers as people with needs and motivations, and just so holistically looking at that, and then also being able to share those insights collaboratively with the team, so everybody can start thinking of it from a holistic viewpoint and be more customer focused. So that's already up on our meetup page, and hopefully we can see you folks for the next meetup. On keep in touch, and we'd love to hear your feedback too, so feel free to put in any comments, suggestions of what topics y'all would like to listen in for the upcoming events. We always like to engage and want to make sure the topics stay relevant. All right, with that, thank you so much, Julia, and everybody. Thank you for participating, listening in, and see you guys next time. Thanks.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Thank you. Good
Take care,
night.
everyone.